It's just marketing buzzwords being used so the company can advertise the newest version of a game in order to get, newer and old fans to buy it. But when it comes to a player base, it's pretty much whatever version of a game they prefer. Let me explain. Many video games have different versions released, especially remasters or remakes down the line, that will often get called the definitive release, usually by the company, because it's a way of trying to get new people to play the game and everything. Such as when it comes to, right now, recently, we have Persona 4 Revival, which people are referring to as the definitive edition of Persona 4, even though it's not been out yet. But Mutual Mind mentioned the topic about the fact that before Persona 4 Revival, Persona 4 Golden was seen as the definitive edition of Persona 4, but now it's not anymore. If you ask someone like me, the original release of Persona 4 is the definitive edition, because it really just depends on the person when it comes to what they find as definitive. For some people, it's basically which version has the most content. So at the current time right now, Persona 4 Golden has the most content with them being a re-release that added in new stuff, or it also made changes to the game in order to add new features and stuff to it, so people say that makes it the definitive release of the game. But Persona 4 Revival is going to add even more content. Now it's going to be the definitive release. But if we were to then go backwards to Persona 3, you still have fans arguing which one they see as the definitive version. Many like Reload, may prefer FES. Very few actually played the original Persona 3. And no, FES is not the original Persona 3 at all. It has several changes to the game, including the journey. So people saying they played OGP3, unless you actually did, you didn't. And Persona 3 Portable, where each version is so different and unique, people argue back and forth on what is the definitive release of the game. But since Persona 4 Golden just has basically all the base game's content and new content, but the changes you may not like, people will still say it's the definitive version of the game. Same thing also with Shin Tensei 5, where you had that game release, people had some criticism, but people eventually moved on. Then, eventually, we got Shin Tensei 5 Vengeance, which people count as a quote-unquote definitive release of the game, because it still includes the base game's campaign, from the original, the Canon of Creation, but also includes an entirely separate new storyline that you pick from the main menu. It's a separate story, Canon of Vengeance, with some feeling like because it has both campaigns, that makes it the definitive release of the game. But it still has changes to the gameplay that some may not mesh with, so even if you are playing the Canon of Creation, there are still differences in gameplay and how they change stuff that people don't really mesh with when it comes to the Vengeance version of the game, and will still put the original over the re-release and everything, even if the re-release is quote-unquote the definitive version. Some games will flat out just call themselves the definitive edition, such as for the Devil May Cry reboot, which is interesting because normally Devil May Cry calls their re-releases Special Edition, but here it's called the Definitive Edition, with it having many slew of changes to respond to criticism, such as, now you can hit the colored enemies with other weapons, but you just won't stagger them, you have a lock-on button, and stuff like that. Packs all the DLC, adds in Bloody Palace mode, the original didn't have, it removes Virgil's Fedora, which is a sin, and slightly changes the game's ending, on top of slightly changing certain cutscenes, including one cutscene that's also brand new to this version of the game, where people say, by default, this has to be the definitive release because of all the improvements. But when it comes to downsides, there's one, Virgil's Fedora is gone, is also the fact that because the scoring system for the combos has been changed to match the main entries, it does mean that if you were to try to play Virgil's Downfall more like Virgil, which is more slow and methodical, you'll actually get punished more with your score, because now it incentivizes you doing very fast combos and everything. But the playstyle of Virgil in the reboot is way more slower and methodical than the main entry's attacks. Even his fast angel attacks are still relatively slow, and he is more about trying to do setup. So it is an interesting downside when it comes to the change to the Definitive Edition, but it's one that most people will generally overlook and basically not really think about. Some games for the definitive release just include all the DLC, whether it be your Batman Arkham games, your Borderlands, and stuff like that. But then there are some games that don't do that whatsoever, despite trying to be a definitive release, such as when it comes to Dead Rising 2 specifically, which is also an interesting case because you have the original Dead Rising 2, then you have Off the Record, which in itself is technically a remastered Dead Rising 2, but it's also a what-if story entirely, so it's a spin-off, but it also makes updates and gameplay changes to Dead Rising 2 as well. And then you have the Dead Rising 2 remaster that was only released for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, that decided to include all the DLC and everything. However, it doesn't include the standalone games K0 and Case West, both of which that are exclusive to Xbox 360 and can be playable like backwards compatibility on Xbox Series consoles or whatever. But it's still one of those things where, is it a definitive version because you didn't include all the Dead Rising 2 content together for what reason or another? Dead Rising 3 released on PC as the Apocalypse Edition and bundled all the DLC, except for the last DLC that was the fan favorite one. So would one count that as the quote-unquote definitive edition of the game? Bandai Namco has been remastering a tales of games, but one thing they've been doing with the remasters is also removing any licensed DLC the game originally had, so they'll give you all the DLC except for the licensed one, even if it's for licenses that they freaking have the rights to and make no sense not to just include. But the biggest one was the Symphonia's remaster on PS4, Xbox One, and freaking Switch, where not only did that release in a broken state that has since been patched, although the mileage may vary on the Switch version, it's also the fact that this was based off the PlayStation 2 release, something that I don't really see people even knew was a thing often, which meant it has more content, but the frame rate got reduced to 30 FPS, as opposed to 60 FPS from the original GameCube release, with some people preferring the GameCube release because of that, because they rather have the higher performance than the extra content. I mentioned Persona 4 earlier, and people believe, well, even if you ignore the golden storyline, it's still just a better version of Persona 4, to which I go, no, I disagree, because shuffle time was changed, where now you can just make the most busted personas casually, because the mechanic makes it very easy to be overpowered. They basically gave you new combat abilities as well, but the enemies have nothing new to compensate, so you're just way more powerful than everything else going on. And they made changes to boss fights like Shadow Yukiko, which is because the original version people complained was too difficult, but now I considered it way too easy with the way they handled it, so that's why I'm like, I do not consider this the definitive version of Persona 4, even if you ignore the golden storyline. Because you know the golden storyline, you're still left with all these changes that just make the game even easier than it already was. I don't really like that whole entire aspect. Or you're stuck with the extra time they gave you for the golden content, but without the golden story. Which is why I disagree and say Persona 4's original release is so far the best version of Persona 4. You will see most people advocate that someone plays the special edition of Devil May Cry 3, which is the version that got ported forward when it came to the HD collection. Although people have issued the HD collection due to broken visuals, but that's besides the point. Many people will cite the main reason why they recommend Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition is solely because of the difficulty. Because people complain that difficulty in the original Devil May Cry release, or Devil May Cry 3 release, was way too difficult. Specifically the fact that the game's normal difficulty was essentially preset to hard mode, so hard mode is actually very hard mode, and you get the idea. And that's basically the big complaint people have for the original release. The fact that it was way too difficult for them. I say for them because my family played and beat the original DMC 3 multiple times, so it's difficult for y'all, I guess, whole entire thing. When it came to Devil May Cry 3, and the main advocate people have for a special edition is not necessarily the new content that they see as a bonus, but it's because it's the easier one to play over the original release of Devil May Cry 3. No one here is going to argue that Silent Hill HD Collection is not only nowhere near a definitive edition of Silent Hills 2 and 3, it's not even a good version of the games to play. It's a playable version of them if you have no other option, but it is easily the worst versions of the game. But once again, they were touted as the definitive release of them and everything, to the point where people say, just emulate the original release, or instead play a fan-fixed PC port of Silent Hill 2 that's based on an old PC port that had changes to the PS2 version, but the fans not taking it upon themselves to completely fix it up and make it the quote-unquote definitive version of Silent Hill 2, even if it does have many changes from the PS2 version as well. And then you have the Silent Hill 2 Remake, which once again, many will say is the definitive version of Silent Hill 2. Others will say to play a fan-fixed version of Silent Hill 2 as a definitive version was another thing. Do we also include fan fixes for a definitive version of a game? Kind of whole entire thing? Like, the whole topic of a definitive version is generally people thinking either what has the most content or what is the best to play. But then that raises the question, wouldn't the definitive release be something official? And would the definitive release be the original version of the game released by the developers? Because remasters and remakes can and have been done many times by completely different developers. But there are also some remakes like Persona 3 Reload that have been done by the same developers, and yet people still take issue of what they're doing as quote-unquote ruining the game, soulless slop as people like to say, only to find out several of the ideas they had for Reload, such as the whole water-based menus, the main character standing position, and stuff like that, were ideas they had originally that they didn't execute when they released the original game on PS2. So it comes to the question, is the definitive version what the developers wanted to do, or is the definitive version what they actually executed in the release? I asked my brother this question, if a version of a game not made by original developers can be counted as definitive release, to which his response was, it worked for the movie Blade Runner, so yes. The Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster uses the original release of the games in the collection as the base. So that disappointed people because there are people who believe that the GBA versions of Final Fantasies 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 are the definitive releases because they have the most content. My brother heavily disagrees because of the fact that the GBA sound chip is not that great, which means that the music in it will be of worse quality, and to him, music is an important component of Final Fantasy, so by default he says those can't be definitive versions. On top of the fact that the content in those versions, while it has the most content, tends to be content that people don't actually go out of their way to do and really just do the base game story. So for him, his favorite being Final Fantasy IV, he didn't want to say the DS version is the definitive release because it's way too different with how it has to include voice acting. So for him, the definitive Final Fantasy IV experience is Final Fantasy IV's PSP. not just because of the brand new sprites, but because it carries over a mechanic the GBA version introduced, allowing you to actually change out your final party members, not being stuck to the same 5 characters of the original release. Which for him is great because he freaking hates Edge, so to be able to remove him from the party is something he greatly says, and this is what definitive version, you can get rid of that trash character Edge. I then asked about Final Fantasy X, where most people will cite the definitive version of Final Fantasy X is either the remaster, even though some will say it's not because of the visual issues in the remaster, or it's Final Fantasy X International Edition on the PS2, where you still get the bonus content, but you also now have the higher quality cutscenes that ended up not being able to be kept in the HD versions due to losing game source code and assets. To which my brother vehemently said, the best version of Final Fantasy X is the original release, solely because the International Edition includes the Dark Aeons, which are super bosses that will prevent you from backtracking, so ain't nobody trying to walk out and go, oh, I forgot something, go to a town, and suddenly have,
Traitor! Find your salvation on the far plane!
this happen to them and be like, oh yeah, this is the best version of Final Fantasy X, the one that obliterates you, and raise the question, where are these Dark Aeon summoning assholes when Shin is out here trying to destroy all of Spira? Then you also have definitive editions that have it in their name, or it was a point of it, but then they still did stuff that didn't make a quote-unquote definitive edition, whether it be, oh, Persona 5 Royal is definitive Persona 5. I call bullshit on that, but the point here is the fact that they still released DLC for and everything, which meant is really definitive release, you still gotta buy more DLC on top of it for all the stuff in it and everything. I know someone mentioned, well, the old DLC was carried over. Yes, in the West. Not for Japan, we still had to pay like, I think, 10 yen per DLC in order to carry it over into Royal. And then when they re-released Royal and made Persona 5 Royal Remastered, then it had all the DLC included, but then it excludes the Raito Kusunoha DLC entirely. So, once again, is that really the definitive version? I really don't consider Royal definitive version whatsoever because it makes so many changes that are worse to me, but it's the fact of, even if you did like Royal's new stuff, well, you either had the version with to buy more DLC, or you have the version that excluded content. Xenoblade Chronicles had the Wii version, then got the new 3DS version, but then had Definitive Edition on Nintendo Switch. Which now leads us to the recently released Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition Nintendo Switch 2 Edition, which means the Definitive Edition is now no longer the actual Definitive Edition, since now there is a new version of the game with new content, everything. So, once again, that's also a funny thing, where they make a Definitive Edition of a game, slap that on the name of the game, but then make a version down the road that's like, well, this is now the new Definitive Edition, so that previous Definitive Edition is no longer it, even though we freaking named it that. This doesn't make count the monetary aspect when it comes to Definitive Edition, since they are still re-releases, so you are buying the game, sometimes at a lesser price than the original release was, sometimes not. But then there's also the fact of, with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S, they decided, hey, take your old games, and now you can play an upgraded version on the new system. And then they decided, hey, we should actually charge you for that. You want to play the PS5 version of God of War Ragnarok? We got a PS4 disc? That'll be $10, please. You want to play the Switch 2 version of Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild to the Kingdom? $10, please. Want the Switch 2 version of Kirby The Forgotten Land? $20, actually, because entire expansion for an entire thing where, and they start charging you extra money just to play the Definitive Edition, which, for the most part, is just using the more powerful hardware you already freaking bought. And then there's also stuff like I mentioned, Persona 5 Royal. Well, If you have Persona 5 on PS3, well, you gotta buy Royal on PS4. Alright, makes sense, different console if you own it on PS3. But if you own the original on PS4, well, screw you, gotta buy it again at full price for PS4. Great, buy it again at full price on PS5 once again. Or the fact that even also recently with Atelier Ryza trilogy where, oh, the Secret trilogy decided to finally make DX versions years down the line. F you though, you gotta buy the whole game again, can't transfer save file, whole entire thing, and it's like, why are you like this? Octopath Traveler 1 and 2 just recently got announced at Nintendo Switch 2 versions after hyping up as the best versions to play for a Nintendo console owner. F you, they're both full price. We can buy both their Switch 1 versions for the same price it takes to buy one of them on Switch 2, and your save file does not transfer whatsoever. What the actual and at that point, the only thing definitive about it is the definitive amount of money they be taking from your wallet if you actually end up purchasing this. That's what I want to ramble about, since I know the topic is incredibly subjective and could just keep going and everything. I mentioned the tales of remasters and everything that people are like, oh, the remasters are a definitive release because they add quality of life stuff. But there's also some stuff where it'd be like the Berseria remaster is redundant, aside from the fact that it got more ports on other platforms as a main benefit, or the fact that the Tales of Remasters also remove licensed content, even if it's content that Bandai Namco literally owns the licenses or rights to, so it makes no sense to remove them. Or how people say, oh, Resident Evil 4, quote-unquote, has no definitive version, but some will argue, oh, it's the Wii version because of the motion control aiming. But then you could argue, but the motion control aiming completely shits on the game's difficulty because of how much easier it is and convenient, so wouldn't be playing on a controller be more definitive experience? But it comes down to, we're going based on how developers made it or not. Like, for example, the ones with you fan base will effing murder you if you say the best version of the game is Solo Remix. They might half murder you if you say the best version is Final Remix, and some people do agree, but you have people saying, no, the OG experience is where it's at, and stuff like that. Or you have the, mentioned earlier video, eternal debate of Persona 3, which is, do you go by the tactics system and how the game was designed and everything, making it its own unique experience, not only from the Persona franchise itself, but also other RPGs? Or do you go the future versions that just make it play like every other RPG? Or in this case, Persona 3 Portable plays like Persona 4, and then Persona 3 Relay plays Persona 5, to the point where we could argue, does Persona 3 but still keep its own gameplay identity at that point? And I mentioned Tales of Berseria Remastered, but that's another thing. Some people say the definitive version is just the one that is readily available nowadays. Like, even though people did not like the Silent Hill HD collection, because it was the version they could casually pick up, that would be their definitive version. And multiple problems. Sonic Colors Ultimate also had several issues, because the counterpoint is either busting out a Wii U, or emulation. They would say that, Colors Ultimate is the definitive version because that's the one you can just more easily go out, get a copy, download a copy, whatever, it's in your console, you can play the thing right now. And they're just definitive versions that just make the game worse, whether it be content-wise or performance-wise, which, once again, case-by-case basis on what someone is willing to realistically put up with everything. So, either way, go out there, play games, whether it's the definitive version or not, whether or not it's the definitive version to you or not. Said it a day, definitive release to me is just a marketing buzzword getting you to buy the new hotness, but fans will debate which definitive version of a game. My brother believes definitive versions of games do actually exist in everything. It's why, for him, Gears of Persona 4 is definitive release, because Golden rewrites certain characters to the point where they're so different in Golden that they're not comparable to original counterpart, or Revival, which seems to be going so different to the point where he says remakes by their nature are just different games entirely because of how different the remakes tend to end up being and everything. That's all I gotta say. Alrighty then, good day.